Thank you. You can introduce me.
Fine, thanks very much indeed. Kia ora tato, good morning, and thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me to be here today. What we're discussing embodies a whole bunch of issues that are very central to what I think about the world, but particularly about New Zealand's response to it. I've prepared a much larger presentation than I'm going to show, so if at any point there are slides with more detail than I'm going to dwell on now, or you want some more detail on those slides, there will be a large PDF of this presentation up on the Waikato Regional Council website in the next day or so. I have taken a basic theme about local solutions to global problems to pick up on the economic, environmental, and other factors I was asked to consider. But I'm also going to make the case to you that our responses to that have to be quite radical, and indeed, as we look around the world, radical is the new normal. I'll draw your attention to two other things on that slide towards the bottom. My daughter and I started a Facebook page a number of years ago, which we called Kiwiki, which is where we have a discussion on these issues about New Zealand. And I've also started to tweet. So so that's at Oram NZ. I'll talk incredibly briefly about the world, just a couple of big things going on out there, but I'll say a little bit more about how society is responding to that. I'll then take stock of where we're at in New Zealand. I've got next a section about hope, which I'm not going to touch on today. That's not because there is no hope, but that's a whole other presentation in itself. But in a nutshell, what's going on in the world is radical change, but it's change that is brilliant for us in New Zealand if we understand what's going on and respond appropriately to it. So please take hope as a given. So if you find yourself getting depressed about some of the things I am saying, just go back and look at the PDF to get some new hope. In that, my sense of that future for us in the world, there is a very essential paradox, which I will dwell on, and then I'll talk about prosperity in all senses of the word, in fact, the four senses of the word, about economic, social, environmental, and cultural. Let's start here in the world. I'll go back to a phase in 2007 and 2009 when the global financial system froze up 4 times in 12 months, creating a liquidity crisis because the global financial system had completely lost trust in each other, with banks and other institutions stuffed with toxic debt. Very easy to fix. It only took trillions of dollars, and that there was a lot of political will for that and a lot of public support. And that worked, but all it did was not solve anything, but only move us on to this phase, which is incredibly long-running. Nobody knows how many decades this will be. This is a long-running structural crisis in the world. This is very difficult to fix. It's not just about finance or economics. It's about energy use and resource use and values and governance and everything else besides. There is an astonishing lack of political will or public support for the necessary change. Where there is, it only works slowly. Markets are very fearful, and many countries, I would say most countries in the world, are very, very stuck, not knowing what to do, and New Zealand is one. By way of light relief, saving Europe is simple. It only requires the French to reform, the Germans to be extravagant, and the Italians to be mature. My view, the Economist's view, not mine, also from The Economist, this cartoon: people of Greece, we the Eurozone finance ministers are pleased to announce we have successfully reached an agreement on a new arrangement for the deck chairs. It's easy to save Europe. It's a lot harder to save humankind on the planet. Don't worry about the planet, it'll look after itself very well. Highly modified if we don't succeed. And one of the very best places to look at a view out to 2050 is from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Vision 2050 report. You'll see this very clearly in the PDF. Across the bottom are people's values, human development, economy, agriculture, forests, energy and power, buildings, transport and materials. The dark blue are things that need to be done in what it calls the turbulent teens, i.e. these years to 2020, if we are to stand any chance of doing all the rest above that. This is a change of scale and speed of change that humankind has never achieved before. And the risks are piling up. The World Economic Forum, the people who bring us Davos every year, do a global risk analysis every year. This year's was a particular corker, particularly because the World Economic Forum, these are the guys who run big multinationals, ask themselves a central question: is the Occupy movement an anomaly or a harbinger on the road as we examine these seeds of dystopia, given our inability to deal with these accumulating risks? It decided it was a harbinger. This is major business, saying the Occupy movement is not an anomaly, it's not just a bunch of silly people, it's a harbinger of what goes wrong if we don't get governance right. I was in Rio in June for the United Nations Rio +20 summit, along with leaders of 198 or so countries. A few sent ministers instead, as did New Zealand. It was fascinating, 55,000 people, and these people, or rather their minions, came up with a summit document on which they all agreed, 283 paragraphs of complete pap, of which they used the words "we should" 99 times and the words "we must" 3. No, seriously, I've done the count. What was very notable about Rio was, whilst there was a failure of government, there was the rise of civil society, often very colourful, as this gentleman from the Philippines and the Sioux Indian from North Dakota here in the food court. And this is some of our New Zealand delegation, both the delegation and people like me who weren't in the delegation would meet informally most afternoons. And perhaps other small countries could do this too, but when Amy Adams, the Environment Minister, was there, she came along, but there were government officials, there were diplomats, there were young New Zealanders such as Brittany Trelford, front left, who won the global competition to speak on behalf of youth to the United Nations. Kennedy Graham, the Green MP, was the only MP there, apart from the Minister. But the ability for us across an astonishing range of walks of life and skills and interests in New Zealand to meet informally and share those ideas, to me was a sense of what New Zealand's about. But in the rise of civil society, civil society was by far the most impressive, and it was all about the birth of a new democracy that was people-led, not politician-led, locally driven, not centrally controlled, interactive, not authoritarian, creative, not restrictive, networked, not hierarchical, and learning, not stagnating. That's kind of a different way of saying many of the things you've just heard from Peter. What is at the heart of that is community, because these issues are increasingly global, but the solutions are increasingly local. But, big but, these solutions require very strong learning communities, which have, amongst other things, a common sense, a common understanding of what they need to do, a common purpose around what they will do and do, and common wealth. Again, the four wealths that are embodied in the Local Government Act, at least for now. But these are where places where individuals are valued and helped and encouraged so they can contribute. We've got to be able to move far faster than, say, the slowest 25% in the group, which is kind of the speed we move now. We've got to be able to move at, say, the speed of the fastest 15 or 20%, have the courage to do that, but the compassion to bring everybody else along as well. because this is where, once we help people articulate, visualize, and realize those dreams and create solutions that play to those global trends and then build support for bigger shifts, we can finally push governments to do more, and then we can push governments to do more internationally, because it's got to work both ways. Some of the other heroes of Rio for me were actually local government. By far, one of the most interesting streams of work there, I only had a chance to have a tiny taste of it, was from local governments, international organizations like ICLEI, where all of that sense of the community response to these issues and local government, very local, very government, again along the lines that Peter has described, were very impressive. So it was all about voluntary action instead of government mandated. If you go to the Natural Resource Defense Council, a US organization's Cloud of Commitments website, you'll see the sort of things people committed to at Rio, likewise for business through the Business Council. Business made some huge strides, very big sign-up from major corporates to put natural capital, i.e. putting the environment on the balance sheet as an asset and a liability, and of course a lot more progress on things like the Genuine Progress Indicators, or Index, whichever you prefer. Obviously, some people are already doing that in New Zealand, such as Wellington Region. I'm a business journalist. I'm always fascinated by the business response. This is a report from the Confederation of British Industry about the shape of business in the next 10 years. Finance and capital markets are changing beyond all recognition. So are economic conditions. Economic volatility and increased risk is heightened and permanent. There is this big shift to low-carbon economy and other sustainability. The public is losing trust in business. LIBOR is the most extraordinary example of that yet. And then, of course, there's very big social and demographic change too. In the PDF, you'll see quite a few more slides around that nature of change in corporate. And I won't dwell on those. In due course, I'll give you some New Zealand examples. How are we doing in New Zealand? This is NZIER's Lost Time Index, which they produced earlier this year. They took 6 measures, all stripped of inflation, so they are the real measures. GDP per capita, size of the economy expressed per person, consumption per person, stock market returns, house prices, wages, and unemployment. It then looked back to find how many years you looked back to find the same value. So real GDP per capita, i.e. the size of the economy today, is back where it was in 2005. We've lost 7 years. Consumption, 4 years. Stock market returns, 8. House prices, 6. Wages, 3. And yesterday, the unemployment rate, because out 12 years is good, but that shrank yesterday because this is a jobless recovery. We are not alone in that. There are only 3 countries, developed countries in the world, that have positive GDP per capita growth since 2007. Germany substantially, Australia a bit, and the United States teetering in between. So anybody who thinks that the economy is suddenly going to spring to life next year, which most economists do, may be right, although I'm very skeptical it'll be 3.5% growth. I think more like 2.5% is at best. And indeed, growth in the year to March this year, the latest data we have, was only 1.7%. But even if it did spring up a bit next year, all the forecasts have it going back to 2%, because this is an economy that is deeply constrained and deeply stuck. Whether it be skill and capital shortages or very, very weak business investment and very limited government investment. Very important concept here is potential GDP. This is something that typically central banks work out, as our Reserve Bank has done, and that's to measure or estimate how fast an economy can grow before it causes inflation. The Reserve Bank admits it was over optimistic in the early 2000s, and it thinks that potential rate of growth is 1%. So in other words, the Reserve Bank is saying our economy is so constrained that it can only grow 1% a year without causing inflation. We get a break on inflation thanks to high exchange rate at the moment, which makes imports very cheap, but that's the basic measure. If anybody thinks that the way out of this is to become a low-cost economy or strip useful cost out of the system, that's crazy. Nobody ever got rich by trying to be as simplistically cost-saving as possible. The answer to this is a very great deal more strategic on the part of governments and companies and communities. Just to place us in a world context, this chart here shows GDP per capita going that way. This is indexed to 100, so the line in the middle is the median point. Lots of countries producing higher GDP per capita than the average. You see we are well off to the left, so we are well below that median. And in fact, in 2005, this year where this data comes from, but as late as 2008, our GDP per capita in New Zealand was lower than Greece. So in other words, our economy was producing less value per person than the Greek economy. We are not in the same trouble as Greece because A, we are more efficient than Greece and we pay our taxes. We actually do manage to move on and change, which Greece doesn't do. So that's why we survive reasonably well at a lower GDP per person than Greece. The vertical scale is average work week. We're in a bunch of countries that work a lot, but we're actually second only to Iceland. So we're incredibly efficient at producing low-value goods and services, but we've absolutely hit the wall, economic, socially, and environmentally. That's the beaten by the Greeks chart. As a result, our international net liabilities are picking up. That's not government debt. That's the private sector, particularly households. Nice little blip there in 2011. That's reinsurance money coming into the country. We're heading back to where we were before the recession started, or just at the depth of the recession. We are the third most indebted nation in the OECD. We got to double growth. Last time we grew strongly was during the commodity boom in the 60s. Commodity boom won't work again. I'll demonstrate that in a moment. There is a great deal of hope, but I'll move straight on to paradox. I really want you to see that. It's just a teaser to get you in to see that PDF. Here's the paradox. It's very easy to think that there is this abundance of opportunity for us in the world. So there are these hundreds of millions of more Chinese middle-class people and Indians too. And think how rich we could be if we just sold them a few more lamb chops, a few bottles of wine, and got a bit more infant formula and got some of them here on holiday. I started my economics at 14 with economic history, and one of the stories that stuck in my mind as a 14-year-old was in about the 1880s, the very powerful, very wealthy, world-leading cotton manufacturers in Manchester looked to China and said, just imagine how rich we could be if we could just get those Chinese to lengthen their shirt tail by 6 inches. Just imagine how much more cotton we would sell them. The world's changed a bit. Again, it's not about abundance. What is driving change in the world is scarcity, and that's where reinvention comes on. The dairy industry thinks it can roughly double its value, its export worth, between now and 2025. But it's going to come very close to doubling the number of cows. We're milking 4.4 million. I'm not quite sure where the next 4.4 million go. That's not an anti-dairy thing at all. It's just an anti any sense that abundance is going to make us rich. The paradox is that it's not about the cows, it's about the scientists. So if farmers are getting $7 a kilogram for milk solids, well, they won't get that this season. How do we get $17 or $27 a kilogram? Well, it's through the science. And this is what, for example, Nestle does with a health institute looking at nutrigenomics, where you're tailoring nutrition to genes. This is their commercialization arm. They recently announced an incremental investment of this of $500 million US. As far as I can work out, we're spending 15 in New Zealand because almost all our science investment is upstream on farm. Got to keep doing that to farm well. and we are hopeless downstream. Right, so where does prosperity lie, and where does community and local government fit into this? There are very different business models. This is Rod Drury and Zero. He and I both hate the term triple B businesses that people give up after the batch, the boat, and the BMW. People sometimes get very stuck at that point because it's hard to go beyond that. But Rod is building $1 billion business from the beach in Zero. Every time he sees me, he doesn't say hello as soon as he sees me, he says, as he did most recently when I ran into him at the High Tech Awards, 640 million, which I understand exactly is the market cap of Zero. You'll see an awful lot more in the presentation about the nature of these sorts of companies that could thrive anywhere in New Zealand, not just in our one international city. Zespri is an example, again, a slide about many other virtues of Zespri, but this is one focusing on the way it has started to measure the resources, the natural resources going through its business, the carbon life cycle and water footprint, and it's leading to fundamental innovation and change. So, for example, it's pioneering flying German-made kites off the front of ships to save 22% on the fuel bill. Lanzatech in Auckland turns carbon monoxide from the Glenbrook steel mill into synthetic fuel. It's not biofuel, they're drop-in hydrocarbons that exactly mirror hydrocarbons. Stephen Tyndall, still very involved, was the first backer, and very involved in China too. The next pilot plant's just being finished off in Shanghai. This is just the sort of stuff that plays to all these trends. This, however, is the government's economic growth agenda, or rather its second one, and now its defunct one. I'll only dwell on the food and beverage one, where the government reckoned that the sector could treble those exports by 2025. You'll see lots of slides in there that it doesn't work. This is Stephen Joyce's version. He is a man who likes to simplify things. So the business agenda is now driven by, the government's economic agenda is driven by these 6 things. I won't dwell on those other than to say economic transformation is much more complicated than that. And you'll see some slides on that. When I talk about urban New Zealand, I'm obviously using a very broad term because we don't have many very urban places. In many ways, Auckland doesn't even feel very urban compared with even some Australian cities. But the strange thing about this is we largely define ourselves by our rural and wild parts, and indeed we believe rural business underpins the national economy. It's important, but the rural economy, i.e. agriculture and all the rest, is probably at best about 15% of the economy. So an awful lot else happens in the economy. And yet, 87% of us live in towns and cities. We are possibly the most urbanized people in the world. Now, by urbanized, I'm including Cambridge or Tirau. That's where what I would call urban. I'm talking about a community that of that sort. But all our places are in trouble. Our built environments are increasingly unsustainable. Their economies are very weak and inward-looking. Christchurch economically and built infrastructure was a mess before the earthquakes. Auckland's economy mostly only serves its own population. Wellington thought it was going to get rich on government and tourism, and Dunedin is slipping away. So I actually say that in Dunedin, but I time it so I can catch the last plane out of town that night. So that's what we're all working on. The big cities are at it. That was Wellington, this is Auckland, and of course Christchurch. There's a lot to admire in the plan for the centre, but there is no economic strategy to it. And the government says there's going to be an innovation sector and it's going to lead. But whereas the report to government on the Advanced Technology Institute was written in 2 months, it's taken the government 19 months to get it started. So government can't do this. But how about creating a global centre of excellence in dairy genomics or earthquake prediction, rescue and recovery, or 21st century city systems? And that's just Christchurch. But here is the real problem for all of us, and you, because you're at the sharp end of this. Again, I'm using the word city to also embrace down to small towns, but this is one hell of a conflict shaping up between us and the current government. What we want is not what the government's prepared to give us. We want, and people in Wellington, Christchurch and Auckland have certainly said that, is a very attractive compact form. The government wants urban sprawl, public transport, roads, quality urban design, urban guidelines, wide choices in housing. If you want cheap, you're going to have to go into the boondocks. Power to decide and act, strong central control. Enough investment, limited investment. New economy, old economy. Sustainability, you know, worst words in the world. Economy, environment, balance. It's not about a balance, it's about understanding all our best economic and rational choices lie in understanding in what the economic opportunity is in the environment, not balanced against it. It only gets more complicated when you strip any kind of environmental bottom lines out of the EEZ or the RMA, because then you can't achieve the balance by definition because you've got no way of measuring the environmental side. Anyway, local democracy versus central intervention. I was fascinated at the local government conference in Queenstown. There was a unanimous motion against the government's plans. I then read shortly afterwards in Colin James's column that a number of council chairs and chief executives had gone to the government and said, actually, we did vote for that in public, but that's not actually what we believe. I've actually spoken to one regional council chair who's had dinner with John Key, and he very proudly told me that he was suggesting to John Key that things like government-appointed people on regional councils was a good idea, which is indeed something the government is considering. When we're struggling to understand what new democracy looks like, I've given a broad view, Peter's given you a detailed view. I don't think government-appointed people on councils is actually going to do anything for achieving a better outcome in local government. And lastly, this is the corker. This is all the countries in the OECD. It's where the money comes from and where it goes. The blue is central government. As you see, Switzerland has a very, on the far right, has a very small proportion of central government funds funding local activity because they come rapidly down through the canton and then commune level. We are the absolute extreme in the OECD. The money that's raised by local government to spend local is that tiny bit of green at the top. And this government is only making that a great deal worse. This is an extraordinary controlling government under the false guise of financial discipline. Financial discipline can be achieved in all sorts of ways other than through Bill English and Treasury. So we as a country are going nowhere, nor our communities, until we can break this stranglehold on government and particularly the finances. We're seeing this in Auckland, where substantial support, I think, is building for alternative ways to fund the Central Rail Loop. And the simple answer, it's always a simple answer from Stephen Joyce and then Jerry Brownlee, is no, you can't. So one last paradox, and this is the paradox of local government. What our central government is doing is it sees a very complicated world out there, which it is. But it believes the answer is to reduce everything to very simplistic terms, such as that economic growth agenda, also its view of government. But if you go down that road, rather than trying to understand this complexity and finding new ways to work with it, you're in deep trouble. You're in deep trouble because we are substantially dumbing down our analytical skills and our governance skills through this false drive towards a simplicity. Being incredibly creative about making complex things manageable and explained to people is one thing, but quite simply greatly diminishing the Local Government Act, the RMA, and the pending EEZ legislation is a very quick way to poverty for the economy as a whole, but for society. if we reinvented this, if we reinvented local government so we could deal with complexity in effective and manageable ways, and so very big society had a very big expression and the tools to do what it wanted to do through the likes of the Local Government Act and the RMA and the EEZ, that would deliver wealth defined by economy, society, environment, and culture. We've got to learn how to do this because we are responsible for the 5th largest oceanic resource in the world, 1% of the world's Earth's surface. We don't have a clue how to manage this. Fishing quotas is one small contribution, but it's powerless. We're about to, the government's probably about to sign off on seabed mining in the Chatham Rise of good fishing grounds. There's going to be seabed trawling of phosphate nodules to turn into fertilizer for farmers without any ecological impact analysis of what that means. Trying to deal with that astonishing complexity is going to take incredible innovation in terms of how we do deal with complexity. We can't dumb down these things. Which is what is going on at the moment. One last thought, all the pieces absolutely up in the air. So I'm going to quote Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols on that. I'd almost forgotten about him until he made a brief comeback in the Olympic opening ceremony. And it reminded me of this great quote, "You'll have no future if you don't make one for yourself, but the point is the government's got to give you the tools to be able to do it." Thank you.